In this third segment on the presidency and the Constitution, I want to continue with the last argument about the limits on presidential power. Those limits are, of course, those in the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, passed in the 1960s. The first one was impeachment, you'll recall. The second was the 22nd Amendment, passed in 1950, and then the third is the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment's first provision is that in the case of the death, resignation, or impeachment of a president, the vice president will actually become president. Kind of a technical argument that is important because of the wording of the 25th Amendment. Secondly, it provides that in the case of a vacancy in the office of vice president, through death, resignation, or removal, a new vice president can be appointed by the president with the concurrence of a majority vote in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. This is a confirmation process that differs slightly from the original constitutional framework, which would have had a confirmation only in the Senate. But because the House of Representatives has always probably resented the fact that the Senate does all the confirming, they insisted this time that in order to pass the constitutional amendment, allowing a president to appoint a vice president in the case of a vacancy, they would be given the power of confirmation along with the Senate. This is a highly useful provision because it makes it easier in the case of the death, resignation, or removal of a president to have someone immediately present to take the reins of the office. And the provision that a president appoints the vice president is hardly startling. We all understand that in presidential campaigns, after the president has been chosen by the nominating convention, the president makes his preference for vice president known, and without fail, the conventions have been selecting the president's choice for decades, with only a very few occasions in which presidential candidates have said, well, I'll let the convention decide who the vice president should be. So it's a good provision, not very controversial, and is a limit on the president only in the sense that it clarifies what happens in the case of a death, resignation, or removal from office. The next two provisions of the 25th Amendment have a slightly different character. The next limit is one that says, in the event that a president is disabled, ill or disabled, and unable to carry out the duties of office, he can stand aside temporarily and have his position filled by the vice president as acting president. Because of this language that the vice president will be only the acting president, that's why the very first provision of the 25th Amendment had to be clarified. Now this is a useful provision. Particularly in the modern age, we've discovered that in cases in which the president is ill, because of the pressure of the job in the modern era, it's useful to have a way for a president to stand aside and let the vice president take over the duties. There have been some serious presidential illnesses, many of which were left completely hidden from public view for decades. Grover Cleveland had cancer, had an operation for the removal of a cancerous tumor in his mouth, and the whole thing was done in secret on a naval ship where there was no press or no press coverage. He recovered during vacation time, and nobody knew about a serious illness like cancer. But of course, the duties of the presidency were relaxed in the 1880s and 90s, and so it didn't matter all that much. Woodrow Wilson was was ill, and in a much more public way, when he suffered a stroke. Although at the time of his illness, nobody knew he suffered a stroke. He was told simply that he had a bout with the flu, a serious illness, but not necessarily as incapacitating as a stroke, or the knowledge that he had a stroke would have been for his presidency. Would have been good if Woodrow Wilson could have had the provision that he could have stepped aside temporarily, let his vice president, Thomas Marshall, be acting president, and we probably could have avoided a lot of turmoil in the Wilson administration had that happened. Roosevelt, it might have been good if, almost at the start of the fourth term, if Roosevelt had allowed Harry Truman to become acting president. Alas, that didn't happen. And in Eisenhower's administration, when Eisenhower had, I think, 2 heart attacks, an ileitis operation, maybe even a small stroke, all of these illnesses occurred in a in a period of time when the United States was threatened abroad. It would have been good if we could have had an acting president. Sadly, none of these things were possible. Now, the provision of the 25th Amendment makes it possible for a president to stand aside if they're ill. And indeed, this provision of the 25th Amendment has been used by George Herbert Walker Bush, by Bill Clinton, by George W. Bush. All 3 of them have used it when they have found it necessary to be anesthetized for minor surgeries. None of the acting presidencies have lasted longer than 24 hours, and all of them have gone so smoothly that probably very few citizens know that they've actually been used in that way. The last provision of the constitutional limits on the presidency does represent a kind of a limit of a serious nature. The question arises, if you have the 25th Amendment and it allows for someone who knows they're ill to stand aside temporarily, what do you do if you have a president who's very ill but refuses to step aside? And here, the real operational issue is of mental illness. During the 1960s, when this 25th Amendment was proposed and ratified, the great fear was that there might be a president who, in a fit of mental illness, would launch a thermonuclear attack, thereby inviting a retaliation from, say, the Soviet Union and the destruction of much of the developed world, if not the entire globe. So there was a fear, what do we do if the president is ill in that way? How do we prevent that sort of problem from leading to a dangerous war? The concept was that they would use the 25th Amendment in the following way. If the president were ill and did not step aside, and if the vice president and a majority of the president's cabinet concluded he was mentally ill, they could immediately make the vice president acting president. They would have the authority to act that quickly. Now, of course, the observation would be that these are all appointees of the president. They're not likely to take the stand unless it's really absolutely critical. It's evident even to the friends of the president that he cannot fulfill the duties of the office. In fact, the second part of it says, well, if they're such good friends, they might just cover up his illness as other presidential illnesses have been covered up in the past. So there is an alternative statutory provision. Congress would be authorized to create a separate body other than the cabinet, which by majority vote could conclude the president was ill. Now that's not the end of the matter, because to use either the vice president and the cabinet, or the vice president and another alternative body that would decide if the president was ill, both of those open the possibility of a coup d'etat. Now we have the danger that a president is not really ill, but people want to get rid of him for political reasons, and they use some excuse to come up with that kind of a program, that kind of a change of office, and that would amount to a coup d'etat, the kind of thing that we associate with underdeveloped countries where the institutions of government are not as well established as they are in the United States. Nobody wants that. So there's an additional provision, and the additional provision says if the president asserts that he is well enough to hold the office, he can retake the office. But get this, if, however, the vice president and a majority of the cabinet, or this other group formed by Congress, decide he is still ill and can't hold over the office, the vice president stays in as an acting president. But at that point, the Congress is called back into session. There are a couple of deadlines in the Constitution, short deadlines, 24 hours for the notice to go out, I think a few days for them to return to Washington and conduct business. In that circumstance, then, the Congress would have to vote, and by a 2/3 vote would have to agree with the vice president and the majority of the cabinet that the president was ill. In In that case, the vice president would continue to be acting president, and the president would have to step aside. Now notice that that's a 2/3 vote in the House of Representatives and a 2/3 vote in the Senate, that the number of votes required to remove a president under the 25th Amendment are higher than those required to remove him under impeachment. Indeed, there's only really been one time since the 25th Amendment has been passed that it has been considered to be used. That occurred in the presidency of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was accused prior to the election. His political party was accused of engineering a break-in at the Democratic National Convention headquarters in the Watergate Hotel, hence the name Watergate Scandal. After the election, which Nixon won handily, the scandal grew and grew and grew. This is not the place to discuss all those details, but by August of 1974, the president was forced to resign because of the threat of an impending impeachment. In the months of 1974, before the resignation, as impeachment talk became very widespread, there were some people who said, oh, impeachment, that's a major legal issue. Isn't there another simpler way to do it? And there was concern because the president appeared to be ill on a number of occasions. And they thought, well, maybe we could just displace it. We could avoid the need to go through impeachment, which would be a politically difficult thing to do. Maybe we could simply remove him for ill health. Well, Nixon wasn't about to stand aside for ill health. Lord knows, I'm sure from his perspective, what would happen if he got out. They would never let him back. But in the end, even an attempt to try to get him, force him out through the 25th Amendment failed, because, of course, in the end, you needed 2/3 vote in the House and 2/3 vote in the Senate, and you were unlikely to get both. In the end, of course, Nixon did resign because he knew that A, a majority in the House of Representatives was ready to vote to impeach him, and B, he was assured by Republican leaders in the Senate that they had only a handful of votes, less than 10, who were willing to stand by him in the event there was a trial. Now, in that sense, the 25th Amendment had a political impact. It limited what I think a president could do and what other political parties could do. It was not officially used, but unofficially it had the impact. In that sense, these limits that we've talked about have political consequences. It's not that the constitutional provisions are used. It's not that impeachment is not useful because it's been tried twice. 2 presidents have been impeached, but neither has been convicted. That's not the importance of impeachment. The importance of impeachment is that it sits there as a potential threat to be used against a president. And we can't say how many presidents who may have had bad motives were restrained by it. The 22nd Amendment has political consequences. The political consequences are not entirely favorable. They are that when a president's in his second term, he's a lame duck. He has fewer rewards to give friends for supporting his policy and fewer rewards to take away from opponents who might oppose his policy, weakening the president substantially in his second term. Furthermore, the 25th Amendment acts as a limit in the sense that if there were a president who was ill and he were not willing to step aside, the possibility exists of removing him without going through the lengthy process of impeachment. The 25th Amendment does provide, if used properly, a short-term answer to a presidential illness. You could remove a president quickly under the 25th Amendment if the votes were there for removal to take place.